Well, I am grateful you're here today. Today we're transitioning into a new series, and I've been praying. I always try to pray, and I change my mind a lot. So if anybody asked me about 5 or 6 weeks ago where we were going next, whatever I told you was wrong. It's just the way it is. So if you ask me, I'm probably going to change it 3 more times. It's just, I can wrestle. And as I started thinking, I thought, if you realize that we're only a few weeks away from Easter. And so I started praying, okay, Lord, prepare our hearts. And again, I don't want to be the place that makes Easter like this magical thing because really, we celebrate Easter every single day. But I do think that it is an important day and it is an important process. And I want us to prepare our hearts. And so as I was praying, and I've been, for whatever reason, been in the book of John a lot lately. And I was really struck by the things that Jesus has to say about himself. And so I thought, what better way for us to prepare our hearts and minds for Easter than to focus on the statements that Jesus says about who he is, the I am statements in the book of John. And these aren't new statements, these aren't things you haven't heard before, but really what I'm praying for this series is that you will use these statements about who Jesus is to really evaluate and reflect on who he is to you. Because what he says he is, but that doesn't mean he's always that to you or to me. And so I'm hoping that these will be challenging but encouraging reflections on who he is to you. So the first one we're going to look at today is I am... Oh, the bread of life. You were there already. She's so much better than me. I should know better. Listen, I'm always wrong. She's always right. I am the bread of life. And so this is in John 6:35. But before we get there, I want to take just a moment. There's a couple things we'll do before we get to that exact statement. But the first thing I want to do is I want to catch us all up. And again, I know I've got a room full of very knowledgeable, very intelligent people, but I want us to all be on the same page. So I want us to look at the background of the statement, I am, right? Because this is not the first time we hear this, and there's a reason why he's using such specific language. So let's look back at the background. And if you have your notes, I have notes in the back if you want to use them as a resource. But Exodus 3:11 through 14 is where we see this statement used first. And this is Moses at the burning bush. It says, "But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? He said, but I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain." Then Moses said to God, "If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them?" God says to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you." And so he's standing there and he's saying, who do I tell them sent me? See, during this time, names, and we've talked about this, but names are very important. Names represent who you are, where you came from. And really what he's saying to them is, what do I tell them qualifies you to send us? What do I tell them that will validate the fact that you can actually do what you do? Because your name represented who you were. It's not just, I'm not just Brad. The name I had represented what I'm capable of, what I've done. And this is why often God would change people's names, right? And so he's saying, what makes you qualified? And the same way then as it would be now, when we use the word I am, we don't just stop with I am, do we? We say I am smart, or I am strong, or I am whatever. But God didn't say I am blank. He said I am. Why? Because what he's telling him is I am different than you. I am unlike anyone else. And so I'm not just one thing, I'm all things. And so from this moment on, we see that God represents himself as whatever they need, whenever they need it. So he says, whatever journey, whatever you lack in yourself, I am. And so from that point on, God would invoke the name I am and attach it to whatever Israel's needs were. When Israel was hungry and afraid, Jehovah Jireh, I'm your provider. In Exodus 14, when they had this water that would make them sick, Jehovah Rapha, I am your healer. When they were afraid, Jehovah Shammah, I am the God ever present with you. I am everything you need, when you need it, always. This is what he's saying to Moses when he says, tell them I am sent you. I'm the one that will fill every need at every moment, every time. And so this brings us to the Gospel of John. When Jesus says, I am, what is he saying? He's saying, I'm God. See, it's not an accident to say I am. He's using the exact same terminology that God used. And he's saying, I am God. And not only is he saying, am I God, every time he uses one of the, and we'll look at this as we study these, but every time he speaks to I am, he is speaking to the basic needs and desires of mankind. He is speaking directly. When he says, I am this and I am that, I am the bread of life, he's speaking to the basic need of every man and woman. And so this is what he says. When he says, I am the bread of life, he's speaking to a physical and spiritual need of those listening. But before we can really look at what he has to say, we first have to look at what he does. Because the whole chapter 6, we could jump right in and look at his teaching, look at what he teaches them. But he doesn't start with the teaching, he starts with his actions. And so really, in chapter 6, we see 2 miracles and then a message. And so I want us to look at the 2 miracles and then look at the message that Jesus has to say. So here's the first miracle. And again, these are stories we know, these are stories we've heard. But this first miracle, I'm going to get right this time, because the last time I talked about this miracle, I got it wrong. But it's 5 loaves and 2 fishes. I even wrote that down so I didn't say it wrong this time. But let's look at this miracle. Let's look at where he starts in John 6, 4 through 6. So they're traveling. He's on this mountain. He looks up. So it says, now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes, then and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Anytime we see Jesus ask a question, he doesn't need the answer, does he? You needed the answer. You needed to be asked. He didn't need to the answer. And so it says directly, he's testing them. He's putting them in a position that is bigger than them. So let's look at what he says, John 6, 7. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. Here's what he's saying. 200 denarii was about 8 months worth of wages. So what he's stating here, because that means nothing to us on the surface, what he's stating is you could use 8 months worth of salary and it barely feed this group of people. So what is he acknowledging? I can't do this. This is bigger than me. Even if I had 8 months worth of salary in my pocket, they'd still be hungry. And then John 6, 8 through 9. So one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, well, there is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they for so many? So again, Clearly, he's put the problem in front of them, and they are overwhelmed by the problem. He's made his point, hasn't he? He's made the point that this need is bigger than what you can do. So let's look at what he does. Verse 10 through 13. Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in this place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, "Gather up leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. So he shows them a problem. They can't meet the problem. And then what does he do? He shows off like he often does, right? He demonstrates his ability and power to meet the needs in front of us, even when they're bigger than we can meet. But then what happens next? What's the response? How do the people respond to this? Verse 14, when the people saw the signs they had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." And it is important when we read this to remember, we read all this with Scripture in mind, but those experiencing this are seeing it through their experience in mind too. And so when they see what is being done here, they're taken back to their ancestors. And so what have they seen before? Well, during the Exodus, when God delivered Israel from Egypt, they were slaves. And as they were passing through the wilderness, they found themselves without food. They griped, they complained, they were starving. So what did God do? Every morning, except for the Sabbath, on the ground, they would get up, and what would be on the ground? Manna. Every single morning. He provided the food they needed. And this is what they did every single day. And now we come back to here, chapter 6, and Israel is again under the thumb of an oppressor. This time it's the Romans. And they are waiting for another prophet, someone else to deliver them, like Moses delivered them, right? That's what they've been waiting for. So now when Jesus demonstrates this power, feeds them like their ancestors were fed, what does it do? They go, "Oh, this is the one." They said, "This must be the prophet." And I even saw as I was studying, it says that even that there were 12 baskets left over, that it represented the 12 tribes of Israel. And this idea, again, we aren't ingrained in this culture. We aren't ingrained in this world. So we see things like that. We're like, "Oh, that's a lot of food left over." But God never did anything that didn't have symbolism and meaning behind it. And so he's demonstrating, he's showing this. You've been waiting for another prophet. And so they understood instantly the power that was in what he just did, except they didn't quite understand who he was or why he was there. Let's look at verse 15. Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. See, they thought the point was Jesus' ability to put bread in their stomach and overthrow Rome. But when we get there, we'll see his point was always John 6:35. "No, I'm the bread of life." But before he explains it, because he will teach it to them, he will directly explain it, and they won't quite understand it. But before he teaches, my instinct when I read this is to go, okay, now he's going to explain this. But if you look at verse 16, it doesn't say Jesus explains the miracle, does it? What does it say above it? So we get another miracle, don't we? So now let's look at miracle 2. If you look at John 6:16 through 21, here's what it says. When the evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. So the moment Jesus stepped into the boat, the storm ceased, and they arrived on the shore. And in this moment, he's reminding them, showing them that he has the power to overcome whatever storm, whatever problem, whatever challenge is in front of them. But as I was studying, I did find it interesting that though John stops here, and this is the miracle we see, and then he teaches, this isn't the end of what Jesus does before he teaches. If we were to look at Matthew 14, and we were to look at Matthew 15, and I'll just summarize it for us, because remember it says that where were they headed? Capernaum. Now, Capernaum was a place, he had just been with mainly Jewish people. Now he's with the Gentiles. And it says that when he gets there in chapter 14, it says that there was a Gentile woman, and her daughter has died. Her daughter's sick, And when he talks about her, it even says, this woman is a dog in your eyes. Jesus isn't calling her a dog. He's saying that the Gentiles were viewed as a dog. So the Israelites, it makes sense that he came for the Israelites. But he comes and he sees this woman, and her daughter's sick, and he heals her. And why does he say he healed her? Because she had faith. And then right after that, you know what he does again? He does the exact same miracle with the fishes and loaves, but to predominantly Gentiles. And this time he feeds 4,000. And we see this moment of Jesus walking on water, Jesus healing Gentile people, Jesus feeding Gentile people. And what is Jesus saying? I have the power to do anything you need, to do everything you need, to fulfill every one of your needs, and not just for some of you, but for all of you. See, Jesus is about to make some very bold statements when he gives them his message. But this isn't a man who's just saying bold things. This is a man who did bold things. He presented them with a problem that no one could have done, and he did it. They're alone in a storm, and he calms the storm by what? Just getting in the boat. He goes to people who no one else would have went to, and he heals. Why? Because they had faith. He not only fed Jewish people, but he fed Gentiles. And so it's all of that that sets us up for what he has to say next. And so let's look at John 6, 26 through 35. Jesus answered them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you are seeking me not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. Do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give to you. For on him God the Father has set his seal." Then they said to him, "What must we do to be doing the works of God?" Jesus answered them, "This is the work of God, that you believe in him who he has sent." So they said to him, "Then what sign do you do that we may see and believe you? What work do you perform?" Our fathers ate the manna in the wilderness, as it is written. He gave them bread from heaven to eat. Jesus then said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. They said to him, Sir, give us this bread always. Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst. See, he looks at them and he tells them, I'm the bread of life. And he says, listen, he doesn't say, I'll give you the bread of life. He doesn't say, I'll give you a way to feel like the bread of life, but I am the bread of life. Jesus is saying, I am God, and I'm the bread of life. I am what you crave. I'm what you've always craved, and I will satisfy your cravings. And if you were to look at John 6, 34 through 40, if we were to read through those, he says, I, me, or my 17 times. And there's a reason why he says this, because what he's doing here in John 6 is he's putting himself at the center of history. He's putting himself at the center of the Bible. He puts himself at the center of our every need. And he is saying, satisfaction for your deepest yearnings, the cravings in your soul, is in me alone. They go, feed us. We want this bread all the time. He goes, listen, I will give you something that will satisfy you much more than bread ever will. Now, any of you do like being hungry? Any of you get grumpy when you're hungry? None of you, right? I handle myself poorly when I'm hungry. And so I started thinking and looking at this. So what's happening to us when we're hungry? So I did a little bit of research. And so here's what happens when you're hungry and then when you're starving. And there is a difference. We use that word, I'm starving, all the time, right? But here's what happens when we're hungry. The first thing is there's hormonal changes that begin to happen when just we get hungry. I'm not talking about like it's been an hour since you've eaten, but I'm talking about like, maybe you ate breakfast and you skip lunch and you're just so hungry at dinner. And so here's what it says. Hormonal changes. A hormone is released by the stomach that stimulates hunger and increases appetite. So so all of a sudden it's saying, hey, feed me, and our body's being fueled by this hormone. And then a compound is released in the brain that also stimulates hunger. So the body's saying I'm hungry, the brain is saying I'm hungry, and then we get cortisol and adrenaline, and this stress hormone's released in response to hunger, triggering the fight or flight response. So this is when we lash out, we snap at people. What do they call it, hangry? Yeah. We need a Snickers, isn't that what they say? This is what's happening. Our body is producing stress and hormones saying, feed me. And when we're hungry, we get grumpy and we get angry. And not only that, physically things begin to happen. Our stomach constricts, it rumbles, our blood sugar drops, our concentration begins impaired, and our moods change. But then, if we were to go from hungry to actually starving, and there are people who starve, there are people who don't have food for days, and then all of a sudden it becomes more serious. And all of a sudden the metabolism slows down, reducing the energy so you don't produce so much energy. Our muscles start to waste away. Organs begin to shut down. Our immune system begins to get weak. Sorry. And then we get fatigued. Our skin and hair changes. All these things begin to happen to our bodies. And I started to think about this. I don't know if any of you ever watched the show Survivor. Any of you watch Survivor? I know Steve does. So that's my buddy. But I love the show. I get obsessed with things easily, right? And I love that show. And you watch the things they do, like on that show when they get hungry. And you go, oh, it's just a TV show. But I remember the first season, and they're eating rats. And they're like, it's so much better than you would think. I'm like, no, it's not. It's as disgusting as you think it is. It's just you're starving, so you're willing to do things that people shouldn't do. And I was thinking about that, and that is true when we get physically hungry, but it is also true when we get spiritually hungry. When our souls are hungry, we will settle for things that were never meant to satisfy us. We will do things that were never meant to be done. We will let people in our lives, we will settle for shallow, empty relationships. We'll put ourselves in situations just so we'll get complimented because we're starving. Our souls are aching. And so what Jesus is saying is, I am actually here to satisfy your soul. That I will provide and fill you all those cravings, all those achings you're experiencing. And so he goes on in John 6:53 through 60, and he kind of raised the bar here, and he says some things that disciples don't understand, but let's look at them. It says, so Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you shall have no life in you. Whoever feeds on my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. For my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. Whoever feeds on my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I in him. As the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father. So whoever feeds on me, he also will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven, not like the bread that the fathers ate and died. Whoever feeds on this bread will live forever. Jesus said these things in the synagogue as he taught in Capernaum. When many of his disciples heard this, they said, this is a hard saying. Who can listen to it? They were confused. They didn't understand what he was saying. But remember, at the very beginning of this story, John explained that Jesus did this miracle on the eve of what? Passover. And so what he's telling them is he's presenting himself as the new Passover. Here's what he's saying. He's saying that Passover meal where the lamb was killed and his blood was sprinkled over the doorpost, and you ate unleavened bread and the manna that appeared on the ground every morning, all of those things, they all pointed to me, Jesus. He's saying to them, my blood is the real Passover blood. My body is the real manna that is broken to feed and to sustain you. And remember, on the eve of his crucifixion, another Passover meal, what did he say? You eat my flesh and drink my blood. He was setting the stage for what was about to happen. On the cross, he would become the bread of our forgiveness, so that we would never have to feel the starvation pangs of condemnation again. On the cross, he became cleansing for our sin, so that we would be free of sin's stain and shame. So that even though our sins were like scarlet, he could make us white as snow. On the cross, he would reconcile God to me so that I could feast on the bread of knowing that I'm never alone. On the cross, he would give me the power of new life, the power to start over, the power to build life of beauty even when my sin had reduced it to a pile of ashes. See, he was saying that the bread that I have to offer will meet every need you've ever had. As I was preparing, I saw that there was a study a few years ago This nationwide poll was taken. And the question was this: what word or phrase would you most like to hear uttered to you if you knew for a fact it was sincere? So they asked thousands and thousands of people, what word that you could assure that it was sincere, that it was meant, what's the word you would want to hear the most? And there were three that were the most common. And here's the first one, and you wouldn't be surprised, is I love you. Thousands of people said, I want to sincerely hear someone say, I love you. The second was, I forgive you. Sincerely hear that I've been forgiven, that somebody doesn't hold a grudge against me. And the third one, interesting, was dinner's ready. That people, thousands of people said, the thing I want to hear the most is that it's time to eat. And it's funny, but you know what stood out to me? Is that the really awesome thing about the gospel is Jesus says all three things to us. He says, I love you, I forgive you, hey, let's eat. I'll feed your soul. You don't have to be hungry anymore. That's what he's offering. So we hear, I'm the bread of life. That sounds so great. No, he's saying, I will make sure you don't need empty relationships anymore. I'll make sure you don't have to settle for second best. I'll make sure that you don't have to rely on your strengths and your weaknesses, that it won't be your successes and failures, it will be me. I will meet your needs. Now, to wrap us up this morning, I want to share a story that I stumbled upon as I was studying and I was reading, and some pastor wrote his experience with this man. And I'd heard about this guy before. I don't even know his actual name. But it's a story about this man who became a pastor who had this incredibly wild life of, he was an adult film star. They were at this conference together, this pastor and the adult film star became a pastor, and they're talking, and he didn't know his story, and the pastor writes this blog, kind of on his blog, about their encounter. And I just want to share with you this encounter. So here's what it says. It says, the pastor sat down at the table with this guy who was going to be speaking at this conference that he was at. He said, we had an hour or so before the show started, so he asked him what his story was. The man said, I've just written a book called 7 Lies That Will Ruin Your Life That Ruined Mine. He said, before I came to Christ, I was a performer in the adult film industry. He said, I was very successful, but I was miserable. He said, my journey to Christ began in 2015 when a girl I'd known for years, who was from the Raleigh area, said to me, Joshua, the gospel is that you aren't defined by the worst thing we've ever done, nor are we defined by the best thing we've ever done. We're defined by Jesus' love for us. Nothing less, nothing more. He said, just her using my real name got my attention. You see, no one called me by my real name anymore. In my industry, you have an acting name. He then said, and I don't know exactly how to explain, but the combination of her calling my name and speaking the gospel over me, I heard the voice of my Maker speak into my soul. You see, he said, I got into the adult film industry not through one dramatic act, but through one small bad decision at a time. My brokenness led me to further brokenness. He said, my mom had me when she was 15, and my dad left her and started another family on the other side of town. He ended up being well off, but my mom and me lived in poverty. And I had to go to school with his other kids. And I'd see them every day, and they lived comfortably while me and my mom struggled to survive. He said, I felt worthless, unloved, and that's when I started to hear this voice in my heart, voices that told me I was nothing more than the bad things I had done, that no one would ever truly love me, that I'd never be a good father or a good man, that I'd never make anyone proud. And so I turned to the adult film industry to try to satisfy a hunger deep in my heart. And for a while, it was intoxicating. But that day, when that girl said my name and spoke the gospel over me, my Maker unlocked the chains that had shackled my heart. After a few months, I came to Christ, and I was discipled by some very godly men. And now I go around the country speaking at men's conferences and in student ministries, warning them about the true predatory nature of the adult film industry and testifying to the power of the gospel. And then the pastor sitting there with him said, I asked if his book is just his life story, and his response was, not really. I mean, I use my story some, obviously, but I don't want to glorify my story. What I did was a symptom of a hungry heart, a heart that every man I have ever known possesses. Most people will not express their hungry heart the way I did, or to the extent I did. But all of them have the same hungry heart I did. And so my book is more about the bread of life offered to all of us than the particulars of my specific story. And I heard that story, I read that story, and it's a touching story, and it's an impressive story, but it would be a story that would easily go, wow, that's dramatic. But I think it's important for us to take what he said to heart. Because he said, what I did was a symptom of a hungry heart, and that is a problem all of us have. Every one of us have a heart that's hungry. And yes, when we realize that Jesus died for us and it's the only way to heaven and we accept it, he feeds us. But you know what? The same way you have to eat every day, you have to feed on him every day, or you will feed on something else. He wants to keep you from being hungry. But listen, this is not Golden Corral. This is not a buffet where you go and you just fill yourself until you feel disgusting and then you can go a week without eating. No, he will give you a 3-course meal, but it will be daily. But here's what I've learned in my life. No, I've never gone the route this man has. But the things that I'm the most ashamed of, the things where I look back and go, how could I say that? How could I do that? It was when I was trying to feed myself on something other than God. See, the problem, when you try to feed yourself on your family starts to not be good enough. When you try to get your value from your wife, guess what? You will find all the problems that she has, and then that's when all of a sudden you start to think that maybe another woman would help. When you feed yourself on your job, it's never enough. When you feed yourself on your money, it's never enough. And lately, I get this, I don't even know how I got on it, but there's this one Christian website that sends me a newsletter every single day. And I thought, oh, that's encouraging. You know what this thing has turned out to be? Just a list of pastors who have sinned and now are in jail. And I'm like, this is just depressing. And then it hit me. You know how we get there? You know how we cheat on our wives? You know how we cheat on taxes? You know how we hurt people's feelings? When we try to feed ourselves with something other than God. And this is all of us. I don't care if you know God or you don't know God. If you don't feed on him daily, you will settle on something else. And the same way you make foolish decisions when you're physically hungry, you will make foolish decisions when you're spiritually hungry. So I want to encourage you this week to remember that the gospel says, I love you. The gospel says, I forgive you. And the gospel says, dinner is ready. He wants to feed your soul. But you have to eat on him. You have to surrender to him. You have to daily acknowledge that he is the only thing that will satisfy you. So before we leave today, and I prayed about this morning, we were sitting there singing that song, and I thought, Lord, it's easy just to hear this message. It's easy just to challenge each other and say, okay, go. But you know what? When we go, the world is going to bombard us. And I know right now I need a moment just to surrender to God and acknowledge you are the only thing that is going to fill me up. So I'm going to ask that maybe you come down and you just say, Lord, this week I am going to feed on you. This week my kids will not satisfy the emptiness in my soul. My job will not satisfy. My money won't satisfy. My things won't satisfy. Only you. And so the song, I Need You, is going to play. You sit, you come, you do whatever you need. But today, God says, I am the bread of life. Will you treat him as he is the only thing that will satisfy your soul? Lord, Continue to expose me to my need for you. Open my eyes and ask me questions that you already know the answer to. How are you going to do this today? How are you going to feed them? How are you going to lead your family? How are you going to love your wife like I love the church? Oh, you can't do it? I can. Lord, it's no accident that you exposed them to an incredible problem. It's no accident that you showed off your incredible power. It's no accident that you didn't just do it for the Israelites, you did it for the Gentiles. And then said, oh, by the way, that's because I'm the only thing that'll satisfy your soul. Well, this week, every morning I pray we'll wake up and go, God, my job won't satisfy me. My kids won't satisfy me. My wife won't satisfy me. My stuff won't satisfy me, but you, the bread of life, will satisfy me. Lord, help us to every day feed on you. In Jesus' wonderful name, amen.